Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of At the Coalface Live with me, Jason Greenwood, your host. I come to you almost every single Friday from my neck of the woods, which is Auckland, New Zealand, and it is awesome to be here with you. It is the Friday, the 6th of May, 2022, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat with you guys today about something that I guess has been on my mind a little bit lately, but was prompted in particular with a series of news articles and announcement that came out this morning around Shopify and some of the things that are going on in Shopify's world that I think we can learn from, that I think we can use as, I guess, a bit of a cautionary tale, as a learning opportunity, and some of the things that they're facing today will face many entrepreneurs at some point in the life of their business. And I think we can learn a tremendous amount about business, about life, about being a leader, about being a business person, about being an entrepreneur. And I think we could there's a lot of takeaways to be had from that. Now, what I'm going to start out with in order to sort of set the scene for the conversation we're going to have today is I'm going to read to you a post that I posted to LinkedIn this morning that prompted what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to read that post in its entirety, and then I'll come back and I'll sort of talk about some of the bullet points and key learnings I think we can take away from this. And so the post reads, Shopify finds itself in the middle of a firestorm right now. On the one hand, it just announced it will indeed complete its rumored acquisition of Deliver Inc. for $2.1 billion, its biggest acquisition to date. This has been prompted largely by its need to better compete with Amazon and its FBA and MCF logistics services for merchants. On the other hand, Shopify is grappling with what to do about Amazon's new Buy with Prime service. As a locked-down SaaS platform, Shopify would need to integrate Buy with Prime into Shopify for merchants to have access to it. For its part, BigCommerce has already said that it will integrate Buy with Prime into its platform. According to news platform The Information, they said in an article, they were talking about this whole situation with Buy with Prime, and they said that appeared to be settled on Thursday when Shopify CEO Toby Lutka said on an analyst call that he was thrilled with Amazon's decision and happy to integrate Buy with Prime into Shopify's offering for online sellers. But a Shopify spokesperson later told The Information that the CEO was only sharing his opinion on the matter and that the e-commerce company still needed to gather more details before deciding what to do. Meanwhile, an internal debate has been raging over the past 2 weeks. And then I said, and one can understand why. They've just spent $2.1 billion for Deliver, and Buy with Prime would not only make Shopify logistics services redundant, but would also kill off one of Shopify's biggest profit pillars, Shopify Payments, since the payment would be processed by Amazon, not Shopify, for all Buy with Prime purchases. This integration would also seem to fly in the face of Shopify's oft-stated goal of arming the rebels against Amazon. But then again, merchants everywhere are salivating at the thought of easy access to the 200 million plus Prime subscribers out there, which Shopify cannot ignore. Shopify is truly between a rock and a hard place here, especially if Amazon eventually launches its own competing DTC e-commerce platform to rival Shopify, as it's rumored to be planning. What do you think they will do? So obviously this sparked off a massive storm. There was over 83 likes so far. That was posted this morning, and it's had over 83 likes so far, had over 70 comments. So it definitely stirred up a lot of thinking, I guess, in the industry, and everybody kind of had their own take. I think most people, if I was to sum up and sort of make a final call about what initial thoughts were, is that Shopify will resist integrating Buy with Prime for as long as possible, but ultimately it's got a gun to its head, and it will probably ultimately be forced to capitulate and integrate Buy with Prime into Shopify. Now, there's a massive problem with that. If you look at the growth chart, if you look at the revenue and profitability chart associated with Shopify, and you look at the revenue that comes from its licensing, so Shopify subscriptions across all of its plans, all the way from the most basic plan all the way up to Shopify Plus, which starts at about $2,000 US a month and goes up from there. If you look at their revenue growth and their profit growth in their subscription business over the last 5 years versus the revenue and profitability growth of all their other merchant services under which Shopify Payments falls under that umbrella, they diverge radically. Basically, we're in a situation where revenue has gone up. It's on an upwards trajectory, but it's a fairly modest upward trajectory. Whereas if we're looking at the revenue from merchant services, including Shopify payments, it goes almost parabolic. Basically, you see early growth, and then over the last year or two, you see it just almost taking a vertical climb. It goes almost straight up. And so when we look at the percentage of revenue and profitability that comes from Shopify payments and other associated merchant services like buy now, pay later, financing, and other primarily financial services related products from Shopify, when we compare those two, they diverge radically, and we see a massive overdependence on Shopify's success is overly dependent on these financial services and this financial arbitrage mechanism. And when we think about it, basically the subscription revenue is there to support and effectively almost subsidize, and it's almost like a loss leader to bring merchants onto the platform so that they can sell them financial services, so that they can clip the ticket on every transaction that goes through a Shopify store in the form of Shopify payments. And it absolutely makes sense when we think about the fact that Shopify charges a premium, charges a levy to merchants that choose to use a different payment gateway other than Shopify payments. We can understand why they do that. We can understand why they effectively penalize merchants for using any other payment service other than Shopify payments, because that is such a strong growth driver for their business. Now, obviously, this has created a massive overdependency and, in fact, an over-focus on Shopify payments, which is not even their own payments platform. It's a white-labeled version of Stripe. And so, therefore, obviously, they don't get all the profitability from this. They have to give away profits to Stripe. They have to give away a rev share to Stripe as part of this. However, they didn't have to build all the payments plumbing either. So they had a lower capital cost, and they're quite happy to split the take, so to speak, with Stripe. But what that has ultimately led to is a situation where we have this ultra high dependence on Shopify payments and other financial services as the growth driver for the business. And as we see businesses starting to struggle with higher inflation rates, as we see businesses going out of business, as we see likely recession coming up, that has been reflected in a steady decline in Shopify's share price over the last, say, 6 months, roughly 6 months. And it took a further 15% hit roughly today when Shopify announced that it was going to buy Deliver. Now, Deliver is effectively a software-based, capital-light logistics service that is based 100% on software. And so, obviously, Shopify bought these guys for multiple reasons, and obviously none of us have all of the insight into the complete reasons why they bought them. However, they were getting massive pressure from the market to build out logistics capabilities to rival that, or at least to compete with the likes of FBA and multi-channel fulfillment by Amazon. So here we have Shopify investing over $2 billion, its biggest acquisition to date, into Deliver. On virtually the same day, an article comes out very shortly thereafter from the information talking about the internal strife that's going on in the business about how Shopify will handle this new buy with Prime. And we have a backdrop of a falling share price and calls from investors to make clear their strategy moving forward for success. Now, it's against this backdrop that I wanted to talk about what we're going to cover today. And so I think that there's a very rapidly developing situation over at Shopify where Toby's potentially going into a period where Shopify is going to be challenged in ways that it's never been challenged before. And as a result of that, he is going to have to make some of the hardest decisions about the future of Shopify and how its future will look than he's ever had to make before. He's had the opportunity to grow Shopify relatively unchallenged. When we look back, when Amazon got rid of its storefront product, when it got rid of its web store product, and when it effectively ceded the US market in D2C e-commerce platforms to Shopify, obviously Shopify was in the driver's seat. They've got over 2 million merchants running on their platform today. And one could say that they have the lion's share of the market of pure dedicated e-commerce platforms. Now, yes, WooCommerce has larger market share as part of an extension, when we think that they're an extension to a CMS, they've still got larger market share than Shopify. But when it comes to pure or focused e-commerce platform, Shopify is the 800-pound gorilla in the space. And they've largely had the market to themselves over the last 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years, especially when it comes to SaaS e-commerce platforms. They are by far the largest with the most merchants on their platform. So he's had a relatively easy run. And when we think about what's happened over the COVID era, it has added a tremendous amount of fuel to the Shopify rocket ship. And so we've seen Shopify grow leaps and bounds, and it's been reflected in the share price as well as the number of merchants running on the platform over the last 2 years. So it's really only in the last few months, as the market has begun to cool, as COVID restrictions have started to lift, and as physical retail has started to grow in prominence yet again as it starts to open, we've now seen Shopify come under pressure like it hasn't seen potentially ever in the history of the company. And so now we have a situation where Toby, was a fantastic leader during the boom times, and his team were obviously very fantastic. It's not just him. There's thousands of employees over at Shopify, so they're obviously all doing a great job in growing the business during what is relatively stable, relatively easy growth period. Now, not to say that they had no competition, because they certainly have had competition, but certainly in their space and in their vertical and in their target market, they have not experienced a tremendous amount of competition. So we could say that Toby, during that period of time, has been a peacetime general. What does that mean? Well, it means that when things are easy and times are easy, that it's easier to be a general. It's easier to be a leader. So we've got peacetime generals and wartime generals, and that's what I'm trying to compare and contrast today as part of our discussion. So when I think of wartime generals, and when I think of generals that have had to lead during wartime, both in real wars as well as in business wars, where there have been severe challenges to a specific category, industry, region, country, or business, when we think of wartime generals, I have observed over my time being in business that wartime generals have certain characteristics in common, and they're often characterized by the following: a willingness to disrupt themselves and bet the farm on a likely but not guaranteed future outcome. And we can think of an example of that in Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook, and he's probably one of the prime examples of that in big tech. When we look back at the history of Meta/Facebook, we can see that they were primarily a suite of desktop applications and desktop focused applications. And once mobile started to become the primary, or at least a major viewport that their users started to use to access their properties, over a period of about 18 months, Mark managed to navigate Meta through an entire reimagining of the entire company to become mobile first. And for those that don't remember, that was traumatic for the business. They had to pour billions of dollars into effectively refactoring and redeveloping their products to be mobile first products and platforms. So obviously today, when we think about Messenger as a standalone product, when we think of WhatsApp as a standalone product, when we think of Instagram as a standalone product, even when we think of Facebook as a standalone product, these platforms are absolutely mobile first platforms. And in fact, some of them are mobile only. When we look at WhatsApp, when we look at Instagram, they're effectively mobile only. Sure, you could do some things on a desktop, but for all intents and purposes, they are mobile only platforms. Now, obviously, when Mark started to make this transition in the business, there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of pundits that said, why would you go and spend billions of dollars when you have this level of market lead? But he was willing to disrupt the entire company and bet the farm on the future of mobile. And he turned out to be considered one of the greatest business minds in the history of business because he was willing to do that. And it turned out so successfully for the business. Meta would not be the business that it is today if it had remained a desktop-focused platform and set of platforms. Now, when we start thinking about Mark Zuckerberg's willingness to disrupt themselves, disrupt his business, and bet the farm on the metaverse, we have yet to see whether that makes good sense or not. The whole entire business is now pivoted away from being a mobile-first platform, and ultimately Mark wants to recreate Meta and its suite of apps as metaverse-first platforms. Now, he's been panned, and there's been a lot of pundits, similar to the pundits that said that it was crazy for Facebook to refocus its entire efforts and refactor their entire platforms to be mobile first. We have these same pundits now coming out of the woodwork and saying that he is insane for betting billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of development effort and time on a platform that may not ever see mainstream consumer adoption, according to them. I think mainstream consumer adoption of the metaverse is inevitable on a long enough time horizon, as does Mark Zuckerberg, which is why he's making such pivotal plays in the space. But this is an example of a wartime general. This is an example of a business and an individual and a leader that is willing to disrupt an existing, highly successful, highly profitable business for the potential and likely future outcome of the metaverse taking over the world. And so Mark Zuckerberg is a fantastic example of a wartime business general. Now, one of the other characteristics, in my opinion, that characterizes a wartime general is someone who is willing to take a scorched earth approach to current business. So, in other words, they're willing to cede ground in one area to win in another. And when we think about Amazon, Amazon is perhaps one of the best examples of this phenomenon. And when we think about the fact that, a few years ago, within a few years ago, I think it was 2015 or maybe even 2017, that Amazon let Shopify pretty much own the whole of direct to consumer e-commerce. And it allowed them to grow market share dominance, and then came in with a Trojan horse over the last month, which is buy with Prime. They have then come in with the Trojan horse after they have allowed Shopify to grow market share and absolute dominance. So whether this was just good luck or good planning, the fact of the matter is Amazon is willing to retrench and retreat in areas where it is not strong and where it doesn't think it can win today. And it will allow competing businesses to win today so that they can ultimately win long term. So they continue to double down on areas where they're strong. So when we think of the doubling down effect, they double down on AWS, they double down on other areas where they're already strong. They have doubled down on the US market. Then as they've gone into new markets like Australia, they start to double down on those markets as they see green shoots of growth. And yet they haven't spread themselves so thin that they've tried to take on the entire world. So they've largely left the whole of Asia alone, and they've largely left the whole of Europe alone. Although they're making some strong plays in Europe today, for many years, they've left e-commerce alone in Europe. And in fact, they've largely left North America alone outside of the United States. They're a little bit strong in Canada and they're a little bit strong in Mexico, but they certainly aren't the lion's share, or they're certainly nowhere outside of America, i.e. the United States, are they as strong as they are in the United States. And so they have leveraged strength in one region to take over one more region, slowly spread, dominate in that region, and they've slowly moved on to other regions. So Amazon has been very, very clever about their plans for world domination, have been very structured. They've been very planned. They've been willing to be patient so that they can establish dominance and land and expand in new areas in very methodical ways. So I think that's a prime example of a brand willing to take a scorched earth approach to their current business model. They're willing to cede ground in one area to win in another. And then they're willing to send in Trojan horses to clean up the rest. Also, when we think of wartime generals, they typically don't allow their businesses to become overly dependent on one single revenue stream. Now, there's obviously exceptions to every rule. And when we think of outliers like Google and their overdependence on their ad platform, even they have recognized the concentration of risk in overdependence on ads. And as a result of that, they have invested billions and billions of dollars in their cloud business to the point now where it is a significant revenue and profit driver for the business. Now, ads still is the lion's share. However, they are making absolute clear-cut plays into other business adjacent businesses now that will help them to continue to become less dependent on ad profitability over time. Now, what we don't see over at Shopify is them doing as good of a job at minimizing the risk and dependence on one single profit and revenue driver. So they have an over dependence on Shopify payments. When we look again, all you got to do is Google the chart of Shopify payments, and in fact, in that post that I made on LinkedIn, one of the other people that commented there put a link to an article about Shopify's predicament, and actually has that graph embedded in that story, where it talks about Shopify's overdependence on Shopify payments, and it shows the divergent graph of where their revenue and profitability is coming from. And Shopify has allowed itself to basically have this cash cow, which is Shopify payments, become overly dependent on it. And then obviously all of their future strategic decisions have to revolve around protecting that cash cow at all costs. Now, one of the other strengths of wartime generals and one of the other characteristics of a wartime general is they are able to resist undue pressure. This is particularly if they're a public company like Shopify and Amazon both are. And of course, Meta is a public company as well. They are able to resist undue pressure of shareholders for long, long periods of time. This is mostly, and it often depends on their share and their governance structures. So when we look at the preferential shares of Meta, for example, and the level of power and the level of control that Mark is able to exert over the company through his preferential A-class shares versus all other common shareholders with their B-class shares, we see a scenario where even if he doesn't own the majority of the company anymore, he still has the majority of the power. And so therefore, the board is largely ceremonial. The other shareholders are largely ceremonial. And for all intents and purposes, Mark Zuckerberg and his progeny will control that company until he no longer wishes to do so. They are talking about doing this exact same thing over at Shopify right now. They do not have the same preferential share structure. So therefore, as of today, Toby does not have the level of control. He is by de facto, he's if not the largest, then he's certainly one of the largest shareholders in Shopify, and he de facto has control of the company as the CEO as well. However, obviously, if he stepped down as the CEO, then he would lose a certain level of control. And so they have already been talking about within Shopify how they can restructure their share structure to ensure a strong founder-led leadership model in Toby, even if he steps down as the CEO and even if he's no longer the largest shareholder in the business. How can we continue to concentrate more and more power into his hands through a share structure arrangement? So what we see, and we've seen with Jeff Bezos, we've seen this with Mark Zuckerberg, and we've seen this with other very, very powerful high-tech company, public company leadership, is that they are more than capable of resisting undue pressure of shareholders in the short term. So shareholders oftentimes want great returns in the short term. Amazon for years did not make any profitability at all. In fact, they were losing money for many, many years. Jeff Bezos had a very, very long-term view of how Amazon would eventually take over not only its immediate market and control over selling books online, but he wanted to build the business into the everything store. And he ultimately wanted to have that be a company that was able to play forever as a merchant. And so he structured the business right from day dot. Even after the business went public, he was very, very clear with investors. He was very, very clear with Wall Street. He was very, very clear with institutionals that, hey, you are not going to necessarily make money on Amazon in the short term. However, we are playing a very, very long game. We are playing a game of dominance. We are playing a game of absolute ownership of our verticals and the categories that we play in. And we are here to disrupt every other major player in the space. That's going to take capital, and it's going to take time to fully play out. Our strategy is going to take many, many years, in fact, decades to play out. So wartime generals generally are able to resist undue pressure of not just shareholders, but other people in the business, other leadership in the business, CFOs, the C-suite, board members, etc. And they are willing to do what is right by the business, even when it is painful, very, very painful to make those decisions in the short term. So based on all of these things, what do the opportunities for Shopify look like today? Well, obviously, I'm only a fly on the wall. I'm not a fly on the wall. I wish I was, but I'm on the outside looking in. So it's very much on the outside of the fishbowl. But as an outsider looking in, there's a few key areas where they could potentially shift or pivot their focus. That could be to, for example, pivot and focus on markets where Amazon is not yet dominant. And as I called out very early on, Amazon does not control the world of e-commerce outside of America. And even inside the United States, when we look at their total share of total retail, it is a tiny, tiny fraction. Inside the United States, sure, Amazon is dominant from an e-commerce perspective, but e-commerce only constitutes just over 20%, perhaps optimistically 25% of total retail revenues in the United States. And as a result of that, Amazon has approximately 50% of that subshare. So when we think of Amazon's share of total retail in the United States, it's perhaps circa 12, maybe 13, maybe 14% of total retail in the United States. So it is absolutely a relatively small share of total retail. So, but they're still dominant, and they're still dominant in a space where Shopify wants to be dominant, which is e-commerce. So even if Shopify defocused the United States and they said, okay, well, Amazon has, a greater than 50% market share of all e-commerce dollars spent in the United States. So therefore, we can consider them dominant there. We can consider them market dominant there. They are not dominant to that degree anywhere else other than the United States. And so if Shopify chose to, they could certainly effectively cede the American market, which they've historically been strong in, to Amazon, and they could completely pivot and focus on markets outside the United States. And they could cherry pick the markets where Amazon is actually the weakest today. And that includes their focus on building out, now that they've acquired Deliver, they could build out their focus on logistics. Now, the challenge is that Deliver has a massive focus on America as well from a logistics perspective. So that doesn't necessarily help them compete outside the United States yet, although that software could obviously be tuned and connected to logistics players outside of the United States. And of course, they could refocus on markets outside the United States, and they could make that pivot pretty quickly. So let's just see what happens there, and let's see how they make that focus outside of the United States. They could also develop an ad network and platform. They could develop a marketplace to compete with Amazon, particularly outside of North America. They could also develop logistics capability, particularly outside the US, as I mentioned. Now, where we come back to ultimately on this is, what will Shopify do with Buy with Prime? Will they hold out as long as they can? Will they capitulate early? Will they, try to help their merchants sell as much goods as possible through their platform and ultimately integrate Buy with Prime? I guess time will tell. But ultimately, I feel like they've got a gun to their head, and I think that ultimately they are going to have to take some radical. This is not a case of being able to make incremental changes to Shopify and that being enough. I think Toby is in the unfortunate position of a Mark Zuckerberg type of decision when they pivoted to mobile, as they are pivoting to the metaverse. Toby is in the unfortunate position of having to make some very big strategic decisions under massive market pressure and a falling share price and the death of COVID, or the dying down of COVID. He's in a very unenviable position of making very difficult decisions, life-changing decisions for Shopify, but under very tight time constraints and under massive global pressure. So what they will do, I have no idea. Again, I don't have any inside knowledge on this, but certainly they're going to have to make some decisions, and they're going to have to make them relatively fast. So hopefully our discussion about wartime generals and what that might look like and what characterizes them and what we can learn from them, and hopefully how we can become wartime generals in our businesses and in the businesses that we work for, in and own and run. Hopefully we can take some of those learnings and we can learn from some of the mistakes that have been made by many other business owners down through the years. And hopefully that prevents us from having to make all those mistakes ourselves. Hope you guys have a fantastic weekend, and I'll look forward to being with you next Friday on At the Coalface Live. Cheers, guys.